And then I'm going to talk a little bit about, our community, what the heck this Agile20 Reflect Festival is, and I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Lichty Ron, and Ron is going to introduce our fabulous speaker today, Kevin Thompson. So let's, everyone please put yourself on mute. Otherwise, I'm going to give host responsibility to Ron, and Ron can put people on mute. That's when you're the host, you have power. You can put people on mute, take their video off, just knock them out, whatever, right? So it's pretty cool to have limited power sometimes. So my name is Jervis Johnson, or Jay for short. It's my nickname. I was called a lot of things in the Navy with the word Jervis. So I had to come up with a nickname. I do not know how I came up with Jay, and I did, and it kind of stuck with me all these 40 or 50 years. We kind of run a community here in San Francisco Bay Area. We call it, the Agile Enterprise or Enterprise Agile. And basically what we decided, it's been going on like 3 or 4 years now. I think last year we kind of decided to change the name and focus on, large corporations and companies that are doing this Agile transformation and adoption stuff, right? Because it's kind of like a different animal than mid-tier companies or startups. Not to say that they don't go through similar challenges and problems through Agile adoption and transformation, but we decided that we would kind of focus on that kind of segment. And so therefore we generally have topics and speakers and information to share that's probably more adaptable to large corporations and enterprises, especially regulated companies and so forth. So that's our community. We have a pretty good community, and we're pretty active. And before COVID, we used to meet a lot and real facilities, and people used to be able to, touch each other and hug each other. It was really cool. Then COVID happened, and now we get to do this. This is cool too, right? But I'm sure at some point in time we'll go back to the other way. But we're trying to think maybe we should still keep doing this. So we're trying to figure out how to do that. The other thing I'd like to introduce is this thing called Agile20 Reflect Festival. If you Google it, there's not anything else out there with that name. And what it is a couple people, 3 people kind of got together and said, well, let's celebrate the 20 years of the Agile Manifesto for February 21 only. And let's see if we can get a bunch of people together to have these multiple meetups and online events across the world. And it's kind of organically grown. I think we're up to like 700 plus events for the month of February across the world. So we have them everywhere in every country and nation in the world. We're going to store the video recordings and so forth so that people can see them after that, because there's the time differences and so forth. I don't think any human being could see that many events in a month of February. So we're going to do that, and that's part of this, is that celebration of Agile and the manifesto. So if you want to see these other events and at your leisure, then please go to Agile20 Reflect Festival and join it, and you'll get access to all of that cool stuff. So without further ado, I would like to introduce my partner in crime, Mr. Ron Lichty. Ron, I am now going to make you host.
Okay. Frightening thought. So by way of introduction, I started attending meetups before there was a meetup.com. I was attending meetups at the turn of the millennium, both around software development. And I started a meetup in Mountain View on software architecture in 2004. And on process, just as Agile was coming to the process core. Kevin, too, had been embracing Scrum during those years. He joined C Prime at the end of 2009 after having worked with two previous companies in transforming them to Scrum. They began featuring Kevin in a series of meetups in early 2010, a couple of which I had the opportunity to attend. I had begun training teams in Scrum myself in 2009, so I was extremely interested in how other Agilists were presenting Agile and Scrum, and Kevin had a really clean, crisp way of explaining Agile. I introduced myself and at one point floated the possibility of being part of his team at C Prime. I didn't, but it was an intriguing conversation, and it continued intriguing conversations over the years. And I really admired his skill at giving insight into Agile. At C Prime, he made some real impacts over the decade that he was there. He would be named their chief scientist. He was their first Agile consultant back in 2009. He was creator of all of C Prime's Agile classes. He was an innovator in the large scale Agile development process, which is the theme of tonight's message. And he was a pioneer in Agile hardware development. He literally wrote the seminal paper on Scrum, using Scrum for hardware development. In 2019, Kevin left C Prime, and I'm going to paste a few URLs into the chat so you can find his white paper on Agile for hardware development. You can find him because he's currently delivering executive and organizational consulting for Agile development, specializing in mixed hardware software product development. And he wrote the book on solutions for Agile governance in the enterprise, which is tonight's topic. So Kevin, I'll turn it over to you, and I'll paste some URLs into the chat for you all.
Thank you, Ron. That was a very nice introduction, and it's been good knowing you all these years. Hello, everyone. Good to see you or hear your voices from around the world. Tonight, I'm going to give a small introduction to a large topic, which is Introduction to Agile Portfolio Management. I could talk for a lot of time about the subject, but we'll try to keep it down to a modest amount of time this evening. Since Ron introduced me, I won't say a lot more about myself. I will say that I have a doctorate in physics from Princeton, and I spent a lot of time in and out of technology and in various environments for various companies over time. And as Ron said, I did a lot of work at C Prime, creating Agile content and being the very first Agile consultant. It's now quite a large company. I left there in 2019 to pursue my own interests, but have very fond memories of my time at C Prime. A couple words about my book, Solutions for Agile Governance in the Enterprise. This is my attempt to distill 10 years of experience into a modest number of pages. And in here, I tried to lay out some basic concepts in project, program, and portfolio management for developing hardware and software products in Agile ways. So I think anything I say tonight, you'll probably be able to find in the book, and a lot more details as well. It is, of course, available on Amazon. Let's look at what we're going to cover tonight. This is an introduction. I'm not going to try to cover all the bells and whistles by any stretch of the imagination, but I do want to cover a few basic ideas when I think of as sort of basic recipes for portfolio management and an Agile approach. I want to look at the concept of business cases, what they are, what you do with them, how to write them. I want to take a close look at the concept of return on investment, which I think most people would regard as an important consideration for portfolio management. How to take the idea of ROI and in turn use that to leverage portfolio decisions. What should you do? What should you not do? And assuming that you have a portfolio and you are managing it and you are developing things, and you have various initiatives that are in various states of execution, how do you evaluate their status? Are they okay? Are they not okay? What does it mean to be okay? And what do you do if it's not okay? So I'll take a look at a fairly brief level at all of these things. In general, we're going to do these things from the perspective of what I call the principles of Agile governance. This is my own language and my own thinking on the subject of what governance means and what Agile means. I'm something of a fanatic for terminology and clarity, so I'll now define my terms. Agile governance. Okay, what is governance? Back in 2013, when I was doing a lot of the earlier work on these subjects, I looked for a good definition of governance and never found one. After months of searching and thinking, I finally came up with a short description that I like, and I call it this: the formalization and exercise of repeatable decision-making practices. To me, in essence, that's what it is. It's not shooting for the hip. It's the stuff that you do routinely and that you formalize and know how to do routinely, and it works. So in simple language, governance is how to decide what to do. Agile governance, in my thinking, is an agile style of governance. Now, you can do a slow-moving heavyweight governance, and it will be governance. It may not be very effective. So I prefer a much faster pace. I prefer an agile style of governance where we enable rapid decision-making based on lightweight artifacts developed with minimum effort. Minimum does not mean zero. It does not mean insufficient. It means try to trim out the fat, try to trim out the delay, get the basic information you need, and don't try to be perfect. Trying to make perfect decisions takes a long time and fails. Get good enough decisions going fairly swiftly, and you're likely to be better off. Now, while I call this agile governance, there's no inherent connection between this philosophy and, say, Scrum as such. You can use the ideas anywhere, and I would suggest that that's a good idea to do so. One of the things I've wrestled with for some time is how to explain this agile stuff in general to people and where it sits along a spectrum of other ways of thinking about the world. And long ago, I came up with this slide, which I call the adaptive spectrum slide, and I think it's my favorite that I've made. The idea is this: if you are planning work and doing work of some kind, you have to deal with the reality of uncertainty. And for my purpose, uncertainty comes in two forms. There's scope uncertainty. How well defined is the things you are going to do, the things you're going to make? And there is effort uncertainty. How well can you forecast the time, effort, or cost of doing that? So I think of the sum of those two things, and I consider that sum to be increasing as we go from left to right, and I lay out the universe of ways of managing work and people across that spectrum. I find it convenient to divide that space into three bins that are called predictive, adaptive, and reactive. The predictive bin is the world of work that is fairly predictable. In the Agile world, this is sometimes referred to as plan-driven work or waterfall style. And it is more or less aligned with classic concepts of project management, as PMI people are familiar with. And if you have predictable work, it is a good way to go. If your work is predictable, then you can create finely tuned plans that optimize for efficiency, trim out waste, and generate results when you expect to. This is usually the case for any kind of work that is repetitive in nature, things you do over and over again, like, for example, painting houses. It's not so effective for things that are unique and one-off. And most of the world of developing products of any kind, software, hardware, or both, isn't very predictable. So then we move into what I call the adaptive part of the spectrum. And this is an area where you do have some concept of what you're doing and the amount of work that's involved, but you will frequently encounter unknown unknowns that you cannot anticipate or plan out. So our approach towards dealing with that space is to do detailed short-term planning, but also emphasize adaptability to rapid changes so we can handle them gracefully and with the minimum cost. Now, minimum cost is not zero. You can't make unknown unknowns go down to zero, but you can deal with them better or worse. Scrum is, of course, the flagship process in this bin, and it does exactly these things well. Go further to the right, you enter the world where your work is entirely reactive. You cannot plan work against a calendar at all because you respond to an unpredictable stream of requests to do things for other people. This is the world of technical support operations, any kind of operational work in general. So here, instead of planning your work, you respond to requests from other people to do work. And the focus is on prioritization and maximizing throughput. This is often referred to as a Kanban style of work. Kanban was born in manufacturing. Interestingly enough, a lot of the same principles apply to business processes as well. So here are the three basic patterns for planning and executing and tracking work that I encounter routinely: predictive, adaptive, and reactive. The agile ones are the two on the right, the ones characterized by Scrum and Kanban. That doesn't mean the one on the left is always wrong. It just means that no one would call it agile. As I said before, if your work is entirely predictable, by all means, use the left approach and don't bother with some of the additional work that is required for a more agile process. That was 3 different styles of working. If you want to think of 3 different categories of processes for planning and managing your work. I'm also going to introduce the concept of levels of governance now. And of course, there are going to be 3 of these as well. From the classic project management perspective, people talk about the project, the program, and the portfolio. A project is a temporary endeavor that delivers some fixed scope thing, like a house remodel or an aircraft carrier. It's probably a bit large for a project. A program is a collection of linked projects managed together. And a portfolio is a group of programs or projects that are managed together. Fair enough. However, the language is entirely project-oriented and does not generalize very well outside that space. And yet, the idea that there are hierarchies of organization does generalize outside the project management world. And 3 levels is a convenient one. So I've adapted the language a bit for what I think of as agile governance, and I refer to a project level rather than a project. So the project level of governance is a team level of governance. It refers to the work of a single coherent or cohesive team of a modest number of people. It's a persistent grouping of people that has some means to do their work. They use some kind of internal process that works. The program level refers to the level of managing collaboration between teams, which does have to be done in an agile world. And the portfolio level is the focus of my talk today. It refers to the development and management of business initiatives, strategic planning, funding, execution of things that lead to work at the lower levels. These levels will exist in any organization that does product development on large scales, whether they develop web applications, jet engines, or something else. Now, that was 3 types of process and 3 levels of governance. And you're thinking to yourselves, there's 27 different combinations of those things. Which ones would actually work? And the answer is very few actually would work, but this is one that does. Here is an agile perspective on the levels of governance and how they interrelate. At the bottom level is our project or our team level. We have one team that has an internal process that works well. It could be Scrum, it could be Kanban, it could be something more like a plan-driven or waterfall process. The key point is it's a cohesive team, it's persistent over time, and it actually functions well. At the top level, we have a series of business initiatives we choose to fund and execute over time for the purposes of keeping our company going. Those are fairly large and usually fairly slow-moving chunks of work that are expensive. These things meet in the middle. Unlike the project model of the world, where the project is the organizing principle, in the Agile space, the team is the organizing principle. We divide our organization into persistent teams that don't just come and go with initiatives. So we talk about the program management level. What we are doing is mapping the work of each initiative, the scope of each initiative, to the set of teams that will do the work. Since teams have an area of focus, their area of focus may or may not be involved in a particular initiative. We see on the top left, initiative number 1. Will be partitioned out across the 3 teams on the left because it requires the areas of focus those 3 teams provide. The second initiative in the middle, turns out it involves only one of the teams, the one on the bottom right. And the third initiative covers topic areas such that the top 2 teams on the right and the middle on the left are required to do it. The mapping of initiative to teams is transient. It is not a persistent structure that is maintained over time. A large part of the program management aspects in the Agile world is defining and maintaining and managing these mappings effectively over time so the organization as a whole functions well. All that said, we're not going to spend much more time on how those mappings are done, but focus instead on the portfolio management aspects. I think of portfolio management as about deciding which initiatives we as an organization are going to undertake and when and in what order we will do them. Also, once they've been launched, are we going to continue the initiatives? Are we going to modify them, change scope, cancel them outright? We will need to do these things at various times. And I want to look at how to make these decisions quickly and effectively. I don't want us getting bogged down in analysis paralysis. I said before, I'm somewhat of a stickler for terms, so I'll define my terms now here. I use the term initiative to be any kind of endeavor that delivers a fixed scope that's large and useful. In essence, it is that. It is a defined scope, some collection of deliverables that was worth paying for and having built. A business case is a document that describes the initiative and contains additional information not only about the scope of the initiative, but various pieces of information that are used to help people make decisions about whether this is something worth funding and doing or not. I think of the portfolio as a set of initiatives that have been proposed and accepted or that are in progress, and the portfolio backlog as a queue that feeds the portfolio. We put things into the portfolio backlog that we may do at some point. I will try to be consistent with these terms as I go forward. One of the things I've learned over the years, and which I emphasize in my book, is the critical importance of well-defined roles. And again, I find a pattern that there are very often three basic roles that have to be done in some fashion. The names change from one context to another, but the fact that there tend to be three of them keeps popping up. So in the context of portfolio management, I want to mention these three roles and define them, the first being the portfolio owner. I'm a big believer in both the power of tapping expertise of a group and in having a single ultimate decision maker. I like having the ability to tap group expertise, but at the same time, I want to avoid analysis paralysis and death by committee. So for that, I want to have a single ultimate decision maker. In the case of portfolio management, I call that the portfolio owner. This is the person that makes the final calls. Next is an agile style of program manager, which is a role that's deeply involved in that middle tier that we saw a while ago. At this point, not only is this person involved in managing and making sure that cross-team collaboration works, but is a resource for portfolio management work as well. A critical aspect of this person's contributions is involved in generating the estimates for effort, costs, and so forth that will be needed to make decisions for the portfolio. And finally, the third role here is what I call area product owner. The area product owner is the person who is ultimately the owner of a business case or multiple business cases. Someone has to write each business case. Someone has to stand up and say, yeah, I think this is worth doing and this is why. And someone has to control the scope of the business case over time. That is this person. Critically, this person is responsible for justifying the initiative. Why should we do this? And I want to point out an important dichotomy here. The area product owner is responsible for saying why this is good. The program manager is responsible for saying things like, and this is how much it's going to cost. I don't ever want one person providing both those two types of information. It's a lot to ask. And let's face it, if I'm the area product owner, this is my favorite thing and I want it done, I might not be the best person to come up with numbers for how much it's going to cost or how long it's going to take, because I might just be a little biased and ignore some of the problems. So as a matter of policy, I always want to make sure the person who comes up with the cost and related information is not the person who actually wants to make this thing happen. I think that's a good policy. These are the basic things that happen at a very high level in the portfolio management in the Agile approach. So our area product owner is the one who drafts these business cases. Creating a business case is not something you do in an afternoon and then it's done. No, you create a draft. You have to meet with these people that what I call portfolio refinement meetings. You need feedback on the quality, the clarity, the effort, the cost, the time. And the people that the area product owner will meet with are the program managers, engineering leads, and everyone else who has insights to offer. Later on, once we have finalized the business case and it's got all the numbers we need, it's time to bring this into our quarterly portfolio planning meeting, where the portfolio owner is going to be facilitating the meeting, reviewing things and keeping us on track, making sure we're addressing each of the options and considering the various possibilities and permutations. This portfolio planning team that really is the set of people will consist of the portfolio owner, any area product owners and program managers involved, and miscellaneous other people that need to know or contribute to this critical decision-making process. The outcome of those meetings will eventually be the plan at the high level that we follow, and we need to assess over time whether or not our various initiatives are doing what we want them to do and are on track and so forth. So we need to have these review meetings, which I suggest at a monthly cadence. Every month, meet and just check on the status of these initiatives. Are they okay? Are they not? If they're not okay, what should we do? I'm also a fan of retrospective meetings, which is probably not a big surprise to anyone. So again, I suggest that quarterly, this portfolio planning team conduct their own retrospectives on how their own portfolio management process is going. This is not a large collection of meetings. In fact, there are only 4 that I've listed here, but this 4 does a pretty good job of covering all the basics. Refinement meeting to polish up the business cases, provide all the information that's needed. The planning meeting, do the planning. Review meeting to check up on in-flight initiatives, and a retrospective to look back on our last quarter and say, how did we do at portfolio management? I'm not going to go through meeting agendas as such, but I'm going to touch on the techniques involved in doing these things. Let's start with the initiative and its business case. In my language, a business case is a document. It describes the concept, the value, the cost, the scope of an initiative. The key point of business case is to do one thing: present the information needed for people to make decisions about whether or not or when to execute the initiative. You can write a lot of things about your initiative, but for the purposes of the portfolio management work, all I care about is the information I need to make a decision. So let's not lard the thing with too much extraneous information that's not going to help towards that goal. In other words, keep it brief. How brief is brief? I would suggest getting it to one single sheet of paper for those that still use paper. We don't need a huge amount of data, nor is it possible typically to read a huge amount of data. So again, keep it brief. The purpose is to enable decision-making. It is not a comprehensive requirement specification. Those have their places. This is not the place. Again, a business case is a document, and there are 2 basic audiences for this document. First is the set of people that are developing the actual document itself, the business case. The product owner, part of the area product owner, drives it. And we have a lot of people who are digging into cost details and so forth. They read this thing, they say, okay, you want these 6 things to happen. You don't want it to blow up on the launch pad. There's a whole bunch of other things that you want out of it as well. We did dig into the details and make sure that we understand the numbers. I'm sure people are generally familiar with engineers and how engineers think and how they come to conclusions. There's always need to dig into the details so they provide insights about the cost, the effort, the time, the resources, and everything else that we need to make decisions. The reality is there is actually no end to all that information. I can go on forever. The challenge is always balancing the desire for these folks to get more and more into details against the reality of, we have a day and a half to come up with the best answer that we're going to get. We can't really spend forever working these things out. It's a tension that never goes away. Some people always want more and more and more information, are never comfortable providing any kind of an estimate. Understood, but we have to stop at some point.
Kevin, do you, there's a question here, whether you think of product owner and product manager as synonymous or how you differentiate them?
I think of product manager as a job title, and I think of product owner as a role with certain specific responsibilities. So I don't make them synonymous, although often they will overlap. Does that address the point of the question? I will hope so.
I just find in organizations, product management is part of the value stream, and the product managers play an important role. And if there are many product owners in an organization, they too need to be coordinated by someone. And so that's why I use the term product manager.
Oh, I agree completely. I'm not trying to get an organizational structure in this talk. Yes, there has to be a structure. There's usually a tree structure of some kind involved in the product management side as well as others. So I agree completely with the concept.
Continue with asking questions or hold off till the end?
We can take a question now.
So regarding the adaptive spectrum that you had a few slides back, for organizations where you're in a hybrid model of, like, for example, agile sales, agile marketing, what are your recommendations for creating a government which would include both those patterns, especially when the split between the adaptive and reactive is about 50-50?
First of all, every organization has multiple patterns. I've never seen an ideologically pure organization in my life.
Right.
For the simple reason that different parts have different needs that are met in different ways. So in terms of managing that, I don't have any particular magic for doing it except maintain good lines of communication and collaboration. Now, if you want to get on a level below that, we could talk about the techniques I use in what I call Agile Program Management, but that's a little beyond the scope of what I can get into in this talk here. Nevertheless, I do have kind of a set of patterns I like to use for keeping those lines working properly.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So back to cost and effort estimation. We need to have some metrics that give us insights. There are risks. Some people are very optimistic. Oh yeah, we can get this done in a week. Some have been burned by being optimistic in the past and yelled at. We can get it done in a year. There's no perfect way to get around that. A good program manager, who's typically is a facilitator for these estimation sessions, just needs to kind of try and keep the team from going too far to extremes. The second audience are the portfolio decision makers. Key point, they're busy people. They don't have a lot of time. They typically cannot spend days and days diving into the minutiae and the subtleties and nuances of each business case. They have to make decisions fairly quickly based on what reasonable information they can gather quickly. So our business cases should be tuned to enable them to get what they need as fast as they can and not force them to wade through lots and lots of details that frankly are not all that important for what they need to do. Risks that they may fall prey to are simply believing the numbers too much at times. Everything is an estimate. Now, there's estimates. These are not actuals in advance. And we need to be careful they have the details they need. We don't skip over the information. If we leave out important details because, oh, well, everyone knows this, then that may lead to mistakes on their part as well. Nothing is perfect. But in general, be aware that these two groups are very, very different. And one can't spend a whole lot of time thinking about the details. I think the business case is having two basic types of information. One, it describes the thing that we are talking about making. We write down what it is and so forth and related information. The other is it provides information the decision makers need to make their decisions. As I said a minute ago, area product owners are, in my terminology, the authors of these things. They are the ones that describe why it's a good thing to do. But we expect our program manager and others to provide the information about cost, time, effort, and so forth. We don't expect, or for that matter, allow the area product owners to come up with those numbers. I want to split across two different groups. So let's talk about the initiative concept first, then the decision criteria following. These are two basic and somewhat different areas. This is my draft form for business case. Other people have their own drafts. I like this, it's fairly short. A title, any short, meaningful title. A few basic perspectives on the thing itself. What problem are we trying to solve? Or what are the opportunities for our customer ourselves in doing this thing? Roughly speaking, in a bullet size list of what are the benefits? If we don't do this, why might we be sorry? The big point is the description, where it is the description of the thing. And finally, last but certainly not least, acceptance criteria. You know, I did bring this in from the Scrum world for good reason. I like to have a list of things that we know that we have to confirm we did before we can say we actually delivered the thing we said we were delivering. So let's try to nail that down a bit. This, I think, is a reasonable compromise between enough detail and too much. By all means, feel free to come up with your own formats, but you'll also have to manage that tension whatever you do. Let's walk through a very brief example. The example here, we have networked medical devices in a hospital setting. These are patient monitoring devices that monitor blood pressure, pulse, oxygen levels, things like that. And if one patient who's wearing one of these starts having issues, monitor station somewhere where the nurses and doctors can see it will pop up a message saying, you know, a warning, so-and-so is experiencing these symptoms right now. Very handy thing to have. And all these network devices send this information to these monitor consoles. And the problem we have as the company that made this stuff is that our devices put out way too much network traffic. We were in a hurry to get this up and running out to the market. We were not particularly efficient in our network protocols, and our devices that are on the network are squawking constantly with millions and millions of little packets of very little information. And the result is that you can't get up more than about 50 of our devices on one network before it saturates. It was okay, we had 5 on a network. It's not so good once you start getting up to 50. So this wasn't a problem a year and a half ago because we weren't a very big company, but now we've got customers that have saturated their networks with as many monitoring units as can fit on one, and they're getting unhappy with this. We need to solve this problem. The benefit is customers that have hit the ceiling can now continue to grow, and new customers will find our solutions more attractive if we fix this problem. If we don't do this, we'll have current customers that are going to be so frustrated they may actually switch to the competing products at some point, and we're going to get negative publicity. The description of the actual initiative scope is here. Now, I won't read the whole thing, but basically it is about our ability to change the network traffic to make it more compact, more descriptive, and more flexible. And this will reduce the number of bytes sent and allow many more devices to be supported on one network at a time. Acceptance criteria. We're thinking about, unlike our current system, we can support 500 devices on a network at once, and other things that I won't bother reading, but they're fairly well spelled out, and we'll know whether or not we hit those goals. So the area product owner wrote that much and brought this draft into one of these portfolio refinement meetings. These are the meetings where the area product owner meets with the program manager and other engineering technical leads to talk about what this thing is, to get feedback on it, the clarity, the scope, does it make sense? And ask these people to come up with the actual values for things like cost, effort, time, and anything else we care about. Now, when I say ask for those things, that doesn't mean they're all delivered by the end of this one meeting. You know, very likely the expert will have to go off and ruminate on these and come back later with this information, and this may take place over the course of a month or so before it all gets nailed down. The key point, though, is to make this interaction happen and to have it identified as, yeah, it'll happen. We're having one of these this afternoon. You know, these people will be there. The right people will be on it. And within a month, our business case will go from drafted to ready for use in a planning meeting. So let's say we've done that. And we're going to segue into our portfolio planning meeting and make decisions about what to do. How do we decide what to do? What makes something worth funding versus not funding? Now, this is an enormous area, and I can't begin to do justice on it fully and won't try, but I can introduce a couple of ideas that I want you to know about. First, let's think about the concept of return on investment. It is certainly an important thing. It's a key driver. I won't say that ROI is the only driver. There are other things as well, but it does matter. So from the perspective of mathematics, I can define return on investment as a ratio of return to investment. Return, some measure of value, investment, some measure of cost. All else being equal, the larger the ROI, the more appealing this initiative is for us to fund and do. And that, of course, means we need to come up with some kind of estimates for return and investment. So let's think about the estimation of these things. It isn't difficult to understand the steps. What's the return? Well, you might, for example, think about a lump sum of money. If we get this, customer X will pay us Y $1 million, and that's it. That's probably rather simplistic. Very often, what we'll get is a revenue stream of some kind, and we're going to talk about the revenue stream as having some kind of a net present value, which is a more complicated thing. But nevertheless, in the end, it is a number, or maybe we have some other concept. And then investment. The investment is some kind of cost to us. It's a number of hours of people's work. It's an opportunity cost to people doing this instead of that. It's actual monetary cost, not only people's time, but also materials and test beds and things like that. Costs real money. The difficulty we have is not conceptual. The difficulty that we have is this ratio often cannot be computed because the numbers for return on investment cannot be derived at all. Why do I say that? Imagine some major new initiative, imagine some major new direction of our company. And we're going to be conceptually funding 5 different initiatives to get to the point of delivering a new solution. We do that, we deliver the solution. No one initiative has a traceable return that comes in even after the fact. We make money, we can't trace it back to initiative X versus initiative Y. So the notion that initiatives can have an obvious return or even a straightforward estimate of cost is usually highly optimistic. And very often these numbers are literally not obtainable even after the fact. And this is just kind of a hard, cold fact of reality. So we have gone beyond the limits of what is possible if we demand that people produce that calculation. Sad but true. So what can we do within the bounds of what is possible? Well, as I said a minute ago, the return can be thought of in many ways. There may be many factors. Customer satisfaction, that can be a factor for doing it. Net present value, other things. Those could all be factors that drive us to do something, but they don't even have the same units, nor can they be typically estimated exactly in a real world setting. Likewise for the investment, whatever it's going to cost us, however we consider investment, it can be many factors and they may not even have the same units. Very often, none of them can be tied to real world numbers. So those are the limitations. Can we do something rather than nothing? Yes. We don't actually need to know what return on investment is in real world numbers. We just need to know whether some kind of ROI between 2 initiatives is better for one compared to the other. And that is a bit more achievable. There is no unique way to do this. In my book, I think I cover like 6 different ways you can approach these questions. But I'll settle on one which is personally my favorite as a nice compromise between sophistication and ease of use. So let's think of return as a weighted sum of standard factors. Net present value could be one of those. Customer satisfaction scores could be another, and so on. The factors don't need to have the same units. Likewise, the investment can be weighted sum of standard factors. And we derive these factors and their numbers based on relative values. Let's walk through an example. Let us say the return factors for our initiatives, we're always going to look at 2. We're going to have, 3. We'll have net present value, urgency, and regulatory compliance. And those are the 3 motives for doing something that we have as an organization in our portfolio analysis. There might be others we could consider, but we decided, you know what, these 3 are the ones you generally care about the most. We'll ignore other possible factors for now. Don't overcomplicate your models. Nothing good happens. On the investment side, what are the things that relate to cost? Maybe we'll say effort to implement and technical risk. Effort to implement is some number. Technical risk, in essence, is a confidence in our ability to do this with the first number. The bigger the risk, the less likely it is that our effort estimates are good. So let's go with these for now and say, yeah, these are good enough for our portfolio planning. Net present value is a number, urgency is a number, regulatory compliance is a number. Let's say urgency and net present value happen to have the same value. Suppose they're both 5. Does that mean that they're the same in significance? Not necessarily. We could say that a 5 for urgency is less significant than a 5 for net present value. So it'll save us some headaches if we provide weights for these factors and say, you know what, the urgency score is half as important as the NPV score. It has a little mathematical complexity. It reduces headaches in other ways. Now, let's look at NPV, for example, net present value. What will we put in there? We're not going to put in the actual monetary values because the numbers get really, really weird. We want all of our factor values to be single digit to low double digit numbers. And I'm just going to say, pull things from the Fibonacci sequence. You decide what 1, 2, 3, 5, and 8 means for NPV, and then use the numbers 1, 2, 3, 5, and 8. Urgency, likewise. How do we register the urgency? Well, let's lay out 5 initiatives on the table and ask ourselves, what does it look like if we sort these in order of urgency, for whatever urgency means? Then the ones that come soonest probably have the highest urgency values. The ones that come later have lower ones. This relative comparison is how we can generate the factor numbers for different factors. It is not something that can be quantified in some kind of real world measurable sense. It is nevertheless reflective of our judgment of what things matter more or less. And this is a numeric way to capture that to some extent. And that is as much as we can accomplish. So suppose we do that, and for this particular initiative, the NPV is 5, urgency is 3, and I won't read the others. Compute the ratio of the weighted sums, and ROI comes out as 0.83. What does that mean? It is not a dollar value. It's a number that makes sense compared to other initiatives and what their ROIs might be. So we go through the same kind of analysis for all the initiatives. I've got 4 of them listed here, A through D. I won't read the numbers off the table, but here in the green column, you can see what the ROIs end up being. They're not the same. The winner, it looks like, is B, which has an ROI of 3.3. Initiative A is trailing the pack with the lowest ROI of them all. So what we've done here is take the limited information we have and try to extract the best insights from it that we can. The process that we used is numeric and quantitative, but it is reflective of our judgments. It is not something that can be measured from real world parameters. In short, it's the best we can do with what it is possible for us to write down and think about. Now, will we actually end up doing those in this order? Maybe, maybe not. There may be other practical issues that constrain the order, but at least we now have a sense of which ones we'd prefer to do compared to others. This is what I call the decision matrix approach for portfolio decision making. It's a nice balance between complexity and power. So we perform this kind of analysis, and then our portfolio planning meeting, we talk through the various options. We don't simply accept blindly the results of an algorithm that says, okay, well, the matrix says you do these things in this order. We don't need to have a meeting. No, the purpose of these calculations and metrics and so forth is to generate insights, not to make the decisions for us. We do need to talk them through. And in the portfolio planning meeting, we do. The portfolio owner is going to go through the list of portfolio business cases that we've queued up, ask the area product owner to present each one a little bit. We'll have group discussions about them. It doesn't have to be highly formalized as a meeting, but we're going to do these basic things. Talk about the value, talk about the cost, talk about the sequencing that we might or might not do, ask program managers to give us some insights on the practicalities of whether we can actually do A and B in parallel or not. That's the person that will know these things. And over the course of this discussion, maybe on one day, maybe across a few days, come up with our plan that is as good as we can get. So we have launched last quarter's initiatives. And a month or two later, they are moving along. We'd like to take a look at them and say, all right, how are they doing? Are they going well enough? Are they not going well enough? Do we need to make some changes? I suggest this is a monthly review meeting. If there's certain decisions we can make, we could continue just as we have been. You know, the assumptions we made are valid, progress is on track, no need to make any change. Or maybe we need to cut scope because we're right about the assumptions, but it's not going as fast as we hoped. It's not going to hit the planned goals. If we really need to finish this by X on the calendar, then we need to have to cut some scope from it. Rarely, work goes faster than expected. We might think about adding some scope or even finishing it soon. Maybe we'll change scope. You know what? We'll do A rather than B here, but continue with the same schedule roughly. It'll be about the same amount of work. And sometimes you just have to cancel things that don't make sense anymore. We were doing this for a particular reason. We had a big possible contract we were thinking would be good for us to work for, and our big customer went somewhere else, and there's honestly no point in continuing this now. No one likes that, but it's better to stop your sunk costs before they get any bigger, and sometimes you need to. This all assumes that you know what your status is and how well it's doing. What's a good metric for that? There's no shortage of metrics, plural, but my favorite is the burn-up chart, which I think is a highly underused metric. It's a very simple chart. It's easy to understand. So for a particular initiative, say week by week, we record certain information. If we're using Agile tracking systems, this kind of information comes out of them fairly quickly. If not, then there are other ways of gathering it. The key point here is we're looking at work completed. So you might call them person days or some other unit, but the amount of work completed based on the, I should say, of the scope intended, it goes up over time, week by week. Those are what the bars are. The line across the top is the scope line. It's the estimate as of today of how much total work is involved to finish the planned scope. It is not unknown for the scope line to move. It's particularly not unknown for the scope line to go up, as we discovered there were things that we have to do that we hadn't realized, and some things that we did know how to do are more work than intended. Now, that is the nature of life, of course. We can't make those unknown unknowns not happen. So very commonly, the scope line will go up somewhat. If it skyrockets, you're in trouble, in which case you may need to do some serious juggling. In general, though, if it's going reasonably well, the scope line will probably go up somewhat. The work completed bars will go up somewhat. At some point, you can kind of roughly guess where they're going to intersect, and it tells you about when it's likely to finish. And if the date where it's likely to finish looks like about what you wanted, then you're in pretty good shape. If you look very, very different, well, then you need to have those discussions we talked about on the previous slide. What do we do? Cut scope or something else? I like the burn-up chart because it is easy to understand. It doesn't try to solve all problems. It doesn't contain all possible data you might use for decision-making, but it gets you somewhere fairly quickly, and that's very much worth having. This meeting where we make the decisions is what I call the portfolio review meeting. And there isn't a lot to say about it, except that we have this discussion for each initiative that's in flight about what we're going to do. And my purpose, I should say my preferred timing on this is once a month. Last but never least is our retrospective meeting. So you may recall from my earlier chart listing the meetings that I'm assuming here a quarterly cadence. We do portfolio planning once a quarter. And at the end of that quarter, before our next portfolio planning meeting, we have a retrospective. So what happened in the last quarter? How well did our portfolio management process work? What are the insights we gained for it? How do we do better? This is a standard retrospective format. It works exactly like all other retrospective meetings do, so I won't go into great depth on it. But in essence, we're looking for things that went well that we should do again, things that didn't go so well we want to improve on, and then have specific owners to drive some of those improvements so they actually do happen. To summarize then, I think of portfolio management as being about deciding which initiatives to undertake and in what order. In other words, creating a plan of work over time at a high level. And also managing the scope over time, managing the cost over time, deciding whether to continue, modify, or cancel ongoing initiatives. I like a standard set of roles. In particular, I like the defined roles of portfolio owner, area product owner, and program manager. It's not there can't be other people, there typically will be, but these will always be there and will have standard definitions that we all understand. And the standard ceremonies or recurring meetings, the ones I listed, portfolio refinement meeting, portfolio planning meeting, and then the review and retrospective meetings. There's one basic artifact, which is the business case, has a fairly simple form, and one basic tracking metric, which is the burn-up chart. There are, again, many ways you can make portfolio decisions. I've listed one here. It's what I call a decision matrix approach, which I think is a nice one, but don't feel that's the only option for you. There are others. A key point, though, is that whatever you do requires working with data that isn't very well defined and is hard to quantify and often doesn't have the same units as other types of data you have. So the notion of defining decision factors, creating a coarse-grained relative scale for them, those are generically useful things and will very likely come into play in almost any strategy you have for portfolio decision making. And with that, I'm happy to take some questions if there are any.
Okay, feel free to unmute yourselves and ask questions.
Yeah, you have a question. And one in the beginning of the slides, if you can go to it, you were talking about the selection process, where you kind of were showing kind of the adaptive, reactive.
Let me see if I can find that. Yes.
Yeah, I think it was like one of the earlier slides. And so I guess I'm curious to get your thoughts on, within the context of a portfolio, right? Where do you feel like, or have you seen, is the best place to kind of, where that decision comes from, right? And so I think, like, in my experience, I think what I'm seeing kind of as you have here, right? You have your predictive work, your adaptive work, reactive, and I would even go so far to say there's maybe a fourth, like evolutionary, which is kind of, I'll know it when I see it, right? We just want to throw money at something, see what happens, right? And so what I find is those 3 or 4 distinct kind of, responses warrant a specific system of delivery, right? So if you think from a classic Scrum perspective, right, you might have organizations, they might have a batch of work that is incredibly reactive. They would just try to like shrink wrap it inside of a Scrum framework and then wonder why their teams aren't really seeing like the right results, right? Measuring all kind of the wrong things that matter. And so what I find is, particularly in large organizations, a lot of that conversation and thought leadership is around, okay, let's really understand our units of work, right? And let's kind of align on what is the most effective system of delivery to execute that work based on whatever the value proposition is, right? If it's time to market, if I want to optimize for time to market versus customer delight or whatever, that might imply different things in terms of your design, your people development strategy, et cetera. And so I guess I'm curious within the context of the portfolio, because that is where that direct linkage to strategy comes from, which should inform how we make decisions at a lower level and how we execute work. What has been your experience in like where that ownership and accountability kind of comes from, right? To make sure that like, not only are you funding things in a specific way, which you're calling out here, but also it's like, okay, let's look at potentially the type of work and make sure that it's actually being supported by the most effective system of delivery. Otherwise, you have organizations, they just try to do all their work through Scrum, right? There's like, no matter what the work is, they're trying to pipe it through Scrum teams, right? And they're trying to unify around metrics that really don't really align with the outcomes and the value proposition of what they're doing. And so I'm kind of curious to get your thoughts if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't have a magic bullet answer for it.
Yeah.
I mean, this is why people pay Agile consultants should come in and help them out, is to figure out which part of the organization should be working in which fashion. Ultimately, it's a management decision. Hopefully it's a well-informed management decision. I wouldn't expect most people in management to have this neat little category scheme in mind and slot things into it. But in the end, it does come down to the people in charge making the right calls, and there's no real magic to that.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Thanks.
Any other questions burning in people's mind?
Hey, Kevin, this is Gopal. I just have a question. There is this whole safe concept of lean portfolio management. You have put things in your book, as well as what you described today is based on your years of experience implementing portfolio management. How would you compare that with the lean portfolio management? Can you, throw a little bit of a light there?
I do not try to keep up with what SAFE is doing. It is something of a moving target and not of, I guess, tremendous personal interest to me. So I don't feel that I'm qualified to give you a very detailed comparison. I would say that there are certain things you can't really avoid doing to be successful. And I imagine you'll find some of those things in the SAFE descriptions as well as in mine or others. But beyond that, I couldn't really give you a lot of details.
Okay. No, I was just wondering, because that's kind of a buzzword today. The other buzzword is beyond budgeting. I don't know if you can throw some light on that one as well. These two are.
I read Beyond Budgeting papers a while ago. They did a really good job describing the problem. And at the time, they did nothing about describing the solution, which I thought was rather irritating. So I agree that the budget for a year and lock it down was probably not a good idea. But at least when I was reading papers several years ago on the subject, I didn't actually find what you should do instead. And what I've done here is, in part, represents my attempt to answer those questions. So I agree with the problem statement that I found in Beyond Budgeting a few years ago. My answer is, generally speaking, you can fund in big ways for a year, but give yourself a lot of flexibility to move money around at the quarter level.
Thanks, Kevin.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Kevin, this is Adam. I'm just wondering whether you incorporate cost of delay or sunk costs in your ROI calculation. It wasn't explicit in your slide. Just want to hear your thoughts on that. Cost of delay and sunk cost.
I don't know what cost of delay is. It's a term that I've seen, and I've never found a good use for it or a good description of it that I could actually use. So I don't really have an opinion on it in that sense. As for sunk cost is always sunk cost. You can't get it back. What matters is not so much how much you spent as it is how much more you're going to spend to get the results, and you have to make an assessment of that.
Cost of delay is a SAFE reference.
I'm familiar with it being a SAFE reference. I'm not a fan of the term or of the concept. I've not seen any descriptions of cost of delay that I thought were worthwhile. So I don't use it myself.
What if I use the term the diminishing market value? The idea that the value of diminishes over a period of time.
That would align with what I was calling urgency earlier. Get it out now, we get something from it. Get it out a year from now, no one will care. And I agree, that's definitely a factor. For a lot of companies, for example, trade shows provide time windows. If we don't get it by this trade show, no one's going to care. So we need to be aware of those timing issues. Absolutely.
Well, thank you.
Net present value has a pretty interesting way of incorporating those kinds of differences based on when we bring it out. Have you? It also makes it more makes calculations of value for one versus another quite difficult. Have you looked at that, Kevin?
Well, I've thought about it. I have to say this. I like net present value conceptually better than I do practically. Meaning I like the fact that it gets across the idea that money comes in over time. The problem is the net present value formula has a number of terms, all of which are basically unknown. And you throw all you can do is throw guesses at them, and the reality is going to probably turn out to be different from what you wrote down. So unless you can actually forecast what happens in the future well enough for the formula to be reliable, I think it's more of a concept than you know, at some point, not so much of a practical tool, or at least not so much a reliable tool.
Kevin, have you spent any time in the Kanban space?
I have.
Are you like a KMP, or have you spent real time in the study of Kanban?
Well, I created a C Primes Kanban class.
Okay.
So I have some knowledge of the subject. However, I don't
Yeah.
have certifications in it, and I'm not pursuing any certifications.
Yeah, because I'm curious how you came up with reactive versus adaptive Kanban versus Scrum.
I was looking for good terminology that I thought kind of reflected what it was like to work in a context, and picked words that I thought reflected the experience of working in that context, and then realized that, you know, the responsiveness, the reactive nature of work that people often had to deal with was well managed by a Kanban concept of how to define work and track it.
Okay. One of the things that I found is that probably a majority of the value anyone gets from Scrum is actually Kanban embedded. And the fact that most people operate from kind of the abstract version of Kanban, you know, in the stage gate version versus value stream mapping is something that really gets lost in translation. So it was interesting to see emphasizing continuous reprioritization, allocation of work to people. One of the principles around Kanban is bringing the people to the work rather than the work to the people.
Fair enough. I think it is a, how would I put it? Most work ends up being Kanban one way or another without anyone knowing that's what they're doing. Very, very often that's the case. It's just you didn't know that was what it was called when you were doing it.
Yeah. And so when you have kind of the reporting that you're talking about, you're talking about the burn up was a value to you. I think the value of a CFD actually becomes tremendously value if you know how to, you know, kind of read into what that report's offering.
Yes, and I wasn't talking about Kanban specifically when I talked about burn up charts. I agree, cumulative flow diagrams are useful in Kanban context. However, I was talking about planned work done over time, which by definition kind of excludes the Kanban concept, because that's a more reactive work where you deal with things rather than plan them out over time. That's the distinction I was trying to make in the slides, the terminology.
Hey, this is Jay. I think one of the interesting things as you go through this at the financial aspects and the portfolio management is your friends in any big company is the CFO and the people that work for the CFO. They know how to measure money and what's important to the company. And it has to be aligned to everything that Kevin just said, right? And it has to be outcome based. You know, what are we delivering to the customer? What are we delivering to the market? How do we measure revenue, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what happens with very large corporations as you get deeper and deeper into the organizational structure, that alignment gets lost. And people make decisions and investment decisions without aligning it to what the outcome should be and how to measure the outcome. So a lot of times we have a lot of arguments about doing X or doing Y or doing less or doing safe or doing Kanban or doing Scrum or whatever. And my question is always, okay, cool. How's that going to reduce my costs? How's that going to increase revenue? How's that going to increase my customer? How can I integrate? How can I connect the dots? And if I can't do it, then why are we doing it? So that's Jay's opinion.
All very good points.
So,
Hey, Kevin.
Kevin, would you consider yourself coming from a specific view around, let's say, a framework in the Holy Wars?
I'm not sure I know how to answer the question. Could you maybe rephrase it for me?
Would you consider yourself to be waterfall or dad, or is there something that you one of the religions that you subscribe to?
I don't subscribe to, how would I put it? Any particular other person's definition of framework says the right way to go. I have my own preferred style of things, which is basically documented in my own book. That's probably the best answer I can give. I think Scrum is very well defined. I think Kanban is not as well defined, but has a lot of good stuff in under that name. So using the name is worthwhile. Beyond that, I have a set of techniques that I like to use that are, I don't claim to be anyone else's except my own, although there's doubtless overlap between what I do and what other people do, just because that's the way the world works.
So bouncing off John's question, I would contend, as you've worked through this slide set, that you presented us with another religion, the religion being portfolio management, or agile portfolio management, and it's much like some of the other religions, at least, it's pretty cut and dried. This is how you do it well, and I really like it a lot. And thank you for sharing it with us. My question is all cut and dried religions degrade. So I can't speak for everyone else here, but the Scrum organizations I walk into, I find many more organizations claiming to do Scrum than I think actually are. Where does Agile Portfolio Management tend to degrade? Where do the problems tend to arise? What are the pitfalls, Kevin?
I think in general, the pitfalls have to do with over specifying and trying to get more certainty out of the world than the word is going to provide you. So it's death by analysis paralysis. You know, we really need to understand the market. We really need to understand this. We need to understand that. You know, let's get a very detailed description of the scope of this thing. Let's make sure we get through enough of the right stages in our process to get it confirmed. And by the time you get through it, the market opportunity is already gone. So my biggest concern is probably about timeliness and over specification. I would rather make decisions fairly quickly and be wrong some of the time than make them really, really slowly and miss most of the opportunities. I think the unwillingness to move swiftly at times and risk things is probably the biggest single flaw that people are prey to.
Mm-hmm. So one of so the using Fibonacci numbers to represent the various categories of investment and cost are quick ways to get to. I see engineers all the time plunge into the well, how many hours is that going to take, as opposed to, well, is it bigger than that one or is it smaller than that one? And we can figure that out, and for a whole project in a few hours. Whereas if we get into the hours discussion, back in my waterfall days, I was guilty of taking engineers into dark rooms for days at a time to figure that out. Very expensive, very painful. So I like I like your answer. There's a question down here of how do we continuously improve our approach to portfolio management? Thank you, Paul.
I would say the retrospective is the key mechanism for that. Every cycle, we should look back on how well we've been doing and be honest with ourselves. You know, all of our cost estimates were so far out of bounds as to be ridiculous. We have been blind to something. Clearly, what is it we've been blind to? We're not going to get perfect, but surely we could do better than a factor of 10 next time around. And other things like that, as long as we're fairly honest in our retrospective, we will improve.
Yeah.
Are there, this is Paul, are there particular things that teams have done that have been particularly insightful in terms of improving their approach to portfolio management?
Interesting question. Nothing jumps out at me at the moment as I think about it. I think probably most thing I can do is kind of circle back to what I said a minute ago. If you are persistent about improving and being honest, you probably will improve. But there's such a wide variation of situations that companies get into that no one thing is jumping out at me as dominant.
Hey, Ken, just again, last question. I'm curious, based on maybe, kind of the work you've done, maybe the work that you've seen elsewhere, in regards to the framing of, Agile portfolio management, like what's your assessment in terms of like the maturity, maybe the comprehensiveness of the material that's out that kind of swirls through the community? Just kind of want to get your thoughts to that, right? Like just to kind of get some context. So, my background is enterprise products and portfolios, right? And so I know a much very different lens of how I see in the Agile community portfolios being framed, right? Tends to be framed as just exclusively investment funding, right? Portfolios are like so much more than that in like real life, right? That's where M&As are coming out, there's merger acquisitions coming out of there, products and partnerships, right? Business value proposition. We know about the classic strategic planning. There's so much richness that comes out of portfolios. I feel like the framing through the lens of like the Agile community is like the focus on like investment funding, right? Like that's the only thing that it seems to be encapsulated. And so I guess sometimes I struggle because I feel like maybe as a community, certainly if you don't have a certain background or experience, like there's this kind of this limited point of view of like what portfolios are in terms of the wholeness of the enterprise dynamics at place, right? It's more than just like investment funding and strategy, right? And so I guess I'm curious to get maybe your observation, your take on, we know portfolios are like the hardest thing to really do, right? Because it's so much there, but just as a community, what's your sense of maturity wise, where you think we are, right? It seems like everyone talks about Scrum, everyone talks about building teams, that's easy, but relative to some of these larger than life concepts, what's your assessment of like where you think we are in terms of the information, the quality of information, how comprehensive is it, et cetera?
Yeah, you raise a really good point there. Specifically in my talk, I focused on one idea. Sure. Because we only had so much time. The one idea is, how do I compare two initiatives to each other to see which one is more favorable? The reality of portfolio management is much more complicated than that. Yeah, you have different categories of things. You may have budgeting by categories. How do you decide whether you're going to invest in this initiative or merge with other company or something else? Sure. A lot of these things are not that easy to compare to each other. Sure. A lot of them require an awful lot of thinking. So there is no one size fits all. And right. I agree that I don't want to offend anybody here, but some of the folks who have tried to view portfolio management things through the lens of a particular mechanism familiar to them often misses a lot of the nuances of the landscape. And I think it's a lot more complicated in portfolio management. And I agree with you in your statement.
Yeah, I think that's just my Ken observations, right? It's like a lot of people in the community have this point of view of like, oh, you do investment funding and you organize people around value streams, suddenly you're going to be more successful. And that's like so not true, right? Like there's so much more to it than that. And so I just wanted to get your candid observation on, that piece. Cool. Thanks, man.
You're welcome. Yeah, optimizing a portfolio is an exercise in difficult judgments, and it's not something that can be quantified or turned into an algorithm. Yeah. And optimizing the set is inherently difficult. It's not likely to become simple.
Yeah. Gotcha. Yeah, right on.
Yeah, I liked your statement that we're not letting the algorithm make the decision. We're allowing it to provide us insight into our making the decision. I thought that was particularly apt.
I'm glad you mentioned that. That's something I believe in very strongly. We're looking for insights. We're not looking for the computer to make our decisions for us.
Kevin, this is, kind of difficult. I mean, it's simple. If I'm running a business, I want to make decisions to make money and decisions to lower my operational costs. I mean, that's what we want to do, right? And we want to get more customers, more revenue, whatever it is to make the company successful. So if I look at the financial aspects, it's pretty simple. Then you got employee health, employee retention. Those are cost factors as well as opportunities for productivity and producing value, right? then
Okay,
what
Jay.
you're
Okay,
saying,
Jay.
you have
Jay, you
another
just named
level
12.
of complexity above that of how to determine that. There's a lot of variations to determine that, right? And a lot of, I don't know, thinking, like you said before, and calculations of some sort, and some form of formulaic type of methods you can apply. But at the end of the day, I'm kind of thinking it's an experiment, and it's going to organically, produce the results or not. But at the same time, we have to be able to experiment and try something and then pivot as necessary. But I think from what you shared with us today, it's, I hate to say this, but it's kind of common things we should be doing, right? And thinking and going through this, right? I think what happens a lot in organizations, you get the politics, you get the culture, you get the complexity of the bureaucracy that inhibit us from doing everything we could to produce the outcome that's needed. Does that make sense?
Agreed. At the portfolio level, things are seldom cut and dried and obvious. And I think one of the biggest risks is what I said earlier, analysis paralysis. We spend so much time trying to get it perfect that we don't actually get anything done. You talked about the need to experiment. The reality is we have no alternative but to experiment. The question is, how fast do we do the experiments? How quickly do we learn from them?
Question for you, Kevin.
Yeah.
So based on what you've shared and how you're kind of delivering or positioning what this view is, because it's kind of referenced in the book and you don't necessarily have a framework or religion that you subscribe to, what makes you valuable and different in the space as you try to sell your services out to any company that would be interested in bringing you in?
Boy, there's a big topic. Oh gosh, I don't know that question has any kind of a straightforward answer without insulting some of the competition, which I don't particularly want to do.
Well, if I'm, if I'm a prospective company that you're talking to right now, what's your elevator to me? What's your Shark Tank to me?
I guess I don't think about that. A track record of success, speaking in general, a coherence to how I do things that I find lacking in a lot of the competition's frameworks. I would say, without getting specific, most things I've heard people describe it as a framework seems to be more of kind of a bin in which ideas have been dumped than something that has an inherent coherence or cohesion to it. And I don't prefer to work that way myself. I prefer to have the pieces fit together in a way that all makes sense. So that would be probably as much as I would like to say on that subject.
Okay.
Okay, any other questions for Kevin? Going once, going twice. Jay, do you want to say anything to wrap up the evening?
So yeah, let's wrap up. So Kevin, fantastic. Thank you very much. This
Welcome.
is very complex, in complexity theory and everything else we do. This is a hard subject. This is about money and about people and about people's lives. And you're making decisions about it. That's hard to do, right? So Kevin, thank you very much for providing this approach and talking about it to us. And thank you everyone else for joining and listening and look for our future events and Agile20 Reflect and all the festival. And I want to thank everyone. Ron, anything else you want to say?
No, I think that's it. So join us for our future events. We have 3 more, well, 2.5 more weeks of the Agile20 Festival, and I think 4 more events. One of which I will be speaking on what's the role of managers in Agile. Do managers have a role in Agile? So check that out. And we've got Johanna Rothman coming up as well. And I forget what else is on the agenda, but we've got a terrific 7 or 8 event month here.
Cool. Well, thank you, everyone. We're going to say goodbye. Thank you, Kevin.
Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you,
Thanks, Kevin.
Welcome.
everyone.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
all.